Hello and good afternoon. I am Nisha Bochwe, the Dean at the University of Minnesota's Humphrey School of Public Affairs. I would like to welcome you to our Swain Climate Policy Series alongside the Big Ten Conference's Democracy in the 21st Century collaboration for today's keynote with climate scientist and educator, Katharine Hayhoe. The Humphrey School started this series last fall to honor a friend of our school and the University of Minnesota, Tom Swain, who turned 100 years old. To celebrate his milestone birthday, Tom wanted to look ahead at the future of our planet, the fate of his grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Tom came to us wanting to enlist his fellow citizens to find solutions and take action to reduce the climate threat. We at the Humphrey School knew we could answer his call, backed by our expertise in public issues that emerge at the intersection of science, technology, the environment, and society. We launched the Swain Climate Policy Initiative to mobilize civic engagement on an ongoing basis through inspiring speakers, student research, and community engagement. In fact, we are a sponsor for the upcoming University of Minnesota event featuring Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who is the best-selling author of Braiding Sweetgrass, Indigenous Wisdom, Scientific Knowledge, and the Teachings of Plants. It's May 17th at Northrop. Please check it out. A special thank you to the Swain Climate Policy Fund donors for making these events happen. I'd also like to thank the Dean of the School of Environment and Sustainability at the University of Michigan, Jonathan Overpeak, who has helped bring Dr. Hayhoe to this lecture series. We are thrilled you have joined us today, and we invite you to discuss ways to advance climate solutions where you are, each of you, students, faculty, and staff across the Big Ten and right here at the University of Minnesota. And please continue to look for upcoming opportunities to get involved with the Swain Climate Policy Initiative. And so now I would like to introduce Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Katharine Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist who studies climate change and why it matters to us here and now. She is also a remarkable communicator who has received the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communication Prize, the Stephen Snyder Climate Communication Award, the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award. That is the coolest award, oh my gosh. And has been named to a number of lists, including Time Magazine's 100 Most Influential People, Foreign Policy's 100 Leading Thinkers, and Fortune Magazine's World's Greatest Leaders. We are in for such a treat. Her TED Talk, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has nearly 4 million views. Her most recent book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, is a national bestseller. Dr. Hayhoe serves as Chief Scientist for the Nature Conservancy, and she is also a Paul W. Horn Distinguished Professor at the Political Science Endowed Professor in Public Policy and Public Law at Texas Tech University. And now I'll turn it over to Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today. One important thing that was not mentioned is I am from the Great Lakes area myself. I am from just over the border from Michigan, grew up in Southern Ontario, went to school at the University of Illinois, and lived in Indiana for some time. So I'm going to be talking about climate change, and I'm going to be talking about how it affects us where we live in ways that we can see from day to day. And that's why I called my talk Mitigation, Adaptation, or Suffering. And that comes from a quote, and I want to share that quote with you to begin. So just a second here. This is a quote by John Holdren. John Holdren is a physicist who served as one of the longest running science advisors the United States has ever had. He served under President Obama in both of his terms. And in speaking of climate change, he said, we have 3 choices. We can reduce our emissions, that's mitigation. We can adapt or prepare for a different future, or we can suffer. And that's not a word that you hear scientists saying often. And he went on to say we're going to do some of each. The question is what the mix is going to be, because the more we cut our emissions, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be. These are the three choices that face all of us. Not just climate scientists, not just decision makers, but every single person on this planet. Because we can't survive without the resources this planet provides. I mean, if you just think about it, take a breath. That air comes from this planet. The water that you might have in the bottle beside you, that comes from this planet. The food you eat, the materials we use to make everything we have, including whatever it is that you're sitting in, whatever building that you're sitting in, all of that comes from this planet. We depend on it for every aspect of our life, and today, our planet's climate is changing faster than any time in the history of humans on this planet. So why does that matter? Well, it turns out that our society, and by that I mean, our society going back about 6,000 years or so, our infrastructure, our energy systems, our agriculture systems, our water systems, our whole way of interacting with each other as a society, it's built on an assumption that we often don't think about. And we don't think about it because it's been true for so long, thousands of years. And that assumption is that we can have hot and cold, and we can have wet, and we can have dry. But the highs and the lows that we've seen in the past and the long-term average, they're reliable predictors of future conditions. In other words, we can determine where it's going to flood in the future by looking at where it's flooded in the past. We can figure out how much water we'll likely have in the future long term by looking at how much water we had in the past. We can design our buildings, how much heating and cooling they'll need based on how much heating and cooling they needed in the past. That's the way that we have designed our entire society. And in fact, even the clothes in your closet depend on this assumption of a stable climate. Do you have winter boots? Do you have a winter jacket? These things often depend on where you live. Now, I live in Texas now, and I still have winter boots and a winter jacket, but I don't use them hardly at all because I brought them down with me. So let's look at what aspects of our society have this assumption baked into them. Well, our residential and commercial building codes. They account for the way climate always has been. What types of crops we grow, where and when and how. When we plant them, when we harvest them, what the crops look like. Why don't you grow cotton in Minnesota? Why don't you grow corn in Texas? Climate. The energy demand that we plan for and we design our buildings for, where our flood zones are, whether we need snowplows or not, what our water plans look like, and so much more. All of these are built on the assumption that climate in the past is a good predictor of what climate in the future will look like. Planning for the future based on the past is like driving down the road looking in the rearview mirror. You're moving ahead into the future, but you're looking backwards as a guide to keep you on the road. And here's the thing. Under some circumstances, that actually works okay. Now, don't say that I told you to do it because I'm not. But if your road is dead straight, if you are driving down a dead straight road, then where you were in the past is a really good predictor of where you'll be in the future, right? But what if there's a curve in the road? What if you're looking in the rearview mirror and you hit a curve? You will run off the road. You will end up somewhere you didn't plan to be. And today, that's exactly what's happening to us. If you picture all of humanity in a giant bus barreling down the road, looking in the rearview mirror, our wheels are already on the rumble strip. We are already realizing that we are not anymore on the road. And why is that? It's because, just a second here. It's because today, climate is changing faster than any time in the history of humans on this planet. This is a figure from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. They had 3 of those that came out this year. The first was on the science, the second was on the impacts, and the third was on solutions. This is from the first one on the science. And what this shows is over time, our average temperature has gone up and down, but over the last century, it has gone up so steeply that it is now warmer than any time during human civilization on this planet. And why is that important? It's important because, again, all of our infrastructure, our food, our water systems, our cities, our supply chains, our economy, everything is built on the assumption that climate is stable. And we know it's been warmer before. Jurassic Park, they're actually remaking it now, right? It's been warmer before and it's been colder before, but we didn't have 8 billion humans on the planet with all of our systems. It's not about the planet. The planet itself will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It's about us humans and a lot of other things that share this planet with us. We are the ones most at risk. When did all of this begin? It didn't begin that long ago. It was back in the Industrial Revolution when people figured out how to dig massive amounts of coal back then, and then oil and gas out of the ground and burn it. That produces heat-trapping gases. Now, our planet already has a natural blanket of heat-trapping gases that keep us at just the perfect temperature for life. But by digging up and burning all these fossil fuels, we were wrapping an extra blanket around our planet. And just as you would if someone snuck into your room at night when you had just the perfect blanket on, you were just the perfect temperature, and they put an extra blanket on top of you, and you'd wake up sweating saying, hey, I didn't need this extra blanket. In the same way, we are wrapping an extra blanket around our planet, and as a result, our planet is running a fever. How is this affecting us? Well, global average temperature is usually the way that people talk about this. Global average temperature has already increased by almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit. But unless you can add up the temperature at every weather station around the world and every single day for years and years and then average it and look for a trend, unless you can do that, and I can't do that without a computer, we don't often experience global warming. So I think it's more accurate, perhaps, from our personal experience to call it global weirding. Why? Because wherever we live, if you've lived there for a while, you notice the weather is getting weirder. I use dice to illustrate this. So wherever you live, you have a pair of weather dice. And you always have a chance of rolling a double six, a storm, a heat wave, a drought, a flood, a wildfire. That happens naturally. Wherever we live across the United States, we're at risk from weather and climate disasters. This is a map showing how many of these have occurred by state since 1980. As you can see, where I now live in Texas, they've had the most. In the Midwest, Illinois and Missouri have had the most. But throughout the Great Lakes, there's a fair amount of really expensive weather and climate disasters. These happen naturally. So where does climate change come in? Well, what happens is as the world gets warmer, decade by decade by decade, it's as if it's sneaking in and taking one of these numbers and turning it into a 6. Taking another number and turning it into a 6. Taking another and turning it into a 7. And so all of a sudden we're like, we just had 3 500-year flood events in 3 years in the city of Houston. How could that be? We just had a 118 degrees Fahrenheit heat wave in Portland, Oregon. How could that be? That's global weirding. Climate change is loading the weather dice against us. We can see this when we look at the whole country. This is the number of billion-dollar weather and climate disasters by year by year from 1980 until last year, because obviously this year isn't finished yet. Now you can see that from year to year, the numbers go up and down. That's weather. But decade by decade by decade, they are ticking upwards. That's climate. And here's a shocking statistic that you can get from this figure. Back in the 1980s, when they first started tracking this data, there was $1 billion weather or climate event somewhere around the United States on average every 4 months. On average, one every 4 months. The last decade that we just lived through, there's $1 billion weather and climate disaster on average every 3 weeks. That's a huge change. And it is adjusted for inflation because this is measured in terms of disasters that cause at least $1 billion worth of damage. Obviously, the value of a dollar has changed over time. That's taking that into account. From 1 every 4 months to 1 every 3 weeks. What about in the Great Lakes region? Well, in the Great Lakes region, it's a little bit more variable because when you go down to a smaller scale, you get a bit more variability. But you can see that in the 1980s, one year had 1, another year had none, another year had 3. And then you go to the last 10 years, every single year has had at least 6. Every single year. Some years have had as many as 12. Going from 0, 1 or 2 to 3 a year to 6 to 12 a year, that's a huge difference. We also see that our temperatures are increasing. It isn't just about what's happening around the whole country, around the whole world. Where we live, average temperatures have increased. You can see our temperature goes up and down from year to year. That's weather. But decade by decade by decade, it ticks steadily upwards. That's the blue line, and that's climate. Why does this matter? It matters because it affects us. If it were just about an increase in average temperature, and that was the only thing that was happening, it would be a scientific curiosity. But we care about it because it's affecting things like our heat waves. The heat waves we had last summer and the summer before that, I don't know about you, but I grew up in a house that didn't have air conditioning. And my parents had to install air conditioning a number of years ago because it was getting way too hot in the summer. We also see that these temperature changes are affecting things like when fruit trees bloom and how much fruit they can produce. They're affecting things like the ticks that carry Lyme disease. They've been moving all through Wisconsin, Minnesota, Southern Ontario, and Michigan. Why? Because we don't have cold enough winters to keep them at bay anymore. So it isn't just about temperature, it's about a lot of other things that come with it. We see that the Great Lakes are being affected. During a summer heat wave, this headline said, Great Lakes temperatures soar to basically bathwater temperature. And you can imagine what that does to all the ecosystems in them. Yearly maximum ice cover is decreasing. That affects all kinds of things from fish to algae blooms to ice fishing. Then there's the fact that our heavy rainfall is increasing too. And in fact, in the Midwest and the Northeast, that's where we've seen the biggest increases in heavy rainfall over the last 60 years. Why is heavy rainfall increasing? Well, warmer air holds more water vapor. So the warmer it gets, the more water vapor there is. And when a storm comes along, as it always does naturally, there's more water vapor for that storm to pick up and dump on us today than there was 50 or 100 years ago. So there's a direct relationship between warmer conditions and increased risk of heavy precipitation. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because, of course, it affects us. In Illinois, farmers can't get into their fields to plant their spring crops because they're underwater. In Detroit, homes are being overwhelmed by flooding. In the city of Chicago, farmers' insurance sued Cook County and the city of Chicago for failing to prepare for the impacts of a changing climate on increased flood risk and leaving insurance companies to pick up the ticket. And they couldn't say they didn't know because 3 years before they sued them, I had actually participated in the city of Chicago's climate action plan, which included projections of how heavy precipitation was increasing in a warmer world. Another reason why I like calling this global weirding, and now that's not a technical term, but I think it just explains what we're seeing, is because in some cases, what we see as a result of a globally warming world could be a bit counterintuitive. Like what? Like the fact that in a warmer world, lake effect snow has been increasing. Now you might say, how can that be? Snow is cold. Wouldn't we see less snow? Here's the thing. When do you get lake effect snow? If you live on this side of the lakes, you know. If you live on the east side, you know when lake effect snow happens. It's when a cold air mass blows across one of our big lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario. It blows across the lake when the lake isn't frozen. So it's below freezing, cold enough to snow, but you need a lot of consecutive days below freezing for the lake to freeze. And if the lake isn't frozen, that cold air mass picks up all of this water vapor, and when it gets to the other side, it dumps it. And that's when you get the crazy 7-foot snows that they've had in Buffalo, New York, for example. But you get lake effect snows on the eastern side of any of the Great Lakes. So what's happening as it gets warmer? We have less multi-freezing days in a row. So the lakes are freezing later in the year and ice is going out earlier in the year. but it's still cold enough to snow. So we actually have more days when there's an unfrozen lake with a cold air mass sweeping over it today than we did 50 or 100 years ago. What else is happening? Well, as it gets warmer and as carbon dioxide levels increase in the atmosphere, it turns out that they are helping algae grow faster. And algae are already a problem in lakes like Lake Superior to Lake Erie because of fertilizer runoff, but it's being exacerbated by higher carbon dioxide levels and warmer temperatures. And these blue-green algae are toxic, and they affect the ecosystems in the lake, and they're made worse when we get extreme storms, so all of that runoff with all the fertilizer going into the lake, followed by drought. All of this is connected, and we see the impacts all around us. We know, too, that as it gets warmer and drier out west, they're getting worse wildfires that are burning greater area. We don't have as many wildfires in the Great Lakes area. We do have some. But this past summer, you could actually see the smoke hanging over our area, some of it from fires as far away as out west, because the fires were so massive that smoke was being blown all the way over here. And we did have some fires also up on the Ontario-Manitoba border as well. But we are seeing impacts right here where we live, and we're seeing impacts from other places coming to where we live in ways that we've never seen them before. Why do we care about these things? We care about them because they don't just affect the planet as a whole, they affect our infrastructure, our transportation, our buildings. They affect the water that we drink. They affect the food that we eat and the farmers who grow it. They affect the air that we breathe and our health and the diseases that we might catch. Climate change is not a standalone issue. The reason we care about it is because it affects everything else that we care about. It affects our infrastructure, our economy, our energy, our water, our natural resources, our health. It affects our food, our biodiversity, our conservation, our justice and equity issues. All of these are tied up with climate change. Specifically, those who have done the very least to contribute to the problem are the ones who are bearing the brunt of the impacts. Climate change is not fair. It affects every aspect of our lives, the safety of our homes, the economy, our health, our food, and our water. So if this is the case, you might say, why aren't we treating it like an emergency then? I mean, if this is really affecting every aspect of our lives, which it is, why are we not acting at scale? It turns out that we humans, the way our brains are wired, we are very prone to something called psychological distance. We are very good at seeing risks as being far away from us in time. Oh, I'll save enough for retirement when I get there. Or far away in space. Oh, that's happening to those people over there, but not here. Being abstract, global average temperature rather than concrete, my house being flooded. Or being irrelevant to my primary concerns. That's what those environmentalists care about. But if I don't see myself as an environmentalist, that's not my deal. It turns out that every single one of these is in play with climate change. And I have some data to prove this to you. So this is a map from the Yale program on climate communication. And they surveyed people all across the whole United States. I'm showing you the whole US, but obviously you can look at your state here. And you can go to their website and you can actually zoom in on your county and your congressional district. They asked people, do you think global warming is happening? And just about everybody said, sure. Anywhere that's orange means more than 50% of people said yes, and the darker orange it is, the more people said yes. So yeah, sure, it's happening. And then they said, do you think it will affect, there we go. Will it harm plants and animals? Non-human species. Distant from us, how? In relevance. People said, sure. Plants and animals, yes. Will it harm future generations? Distant from us, how? In time. Future, not now. Yes. Will it harm people who live in developing countries? Over there, distant from us in space, not here. Yes. And then they asked this question. Do you think it will affect you? No. Most people say it will not affect me. There's a little pocket in Chicago, if you look very closely, a very, very pale yellow. So people in Chicago are 50-50 on this. But everywhere else, it's blue. Most people don't think it will harm them personally. So when we talk about climate change, it's really important not to do what most of the news stories have done over the past 20, 30 years, which is not to talk about it as a future issue or one that only matters to polar bears or ice sheets, but rather to talk about it in a way that's now and here and concrete and relevant to me. What is happening in Minneapolis? What is happening in the Upper Peninsula? What is happening in Detroit? What is happening in the places where we live? All too often, the number one image that is used in news stories to talk about climate change is this. And believe me, I care about polar bears, and hopefully you do too. But if it's only about the polar bears, we totally miss the boat. It's about us too. In fact, after the polar bears, we're next. And that comes from a polar bear scientist. After the polar bears, we humans, our civilization, is completely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because we've built our whole civilization on the idea that we can drive down the road into the future looking in the past. So, but this idea is so ingrained that a few months ago, I was talking to some people in Iowa, and they said, I understand that climate change is very serious, but how do you talk about polar bears where I live in Iowa? And I said, you don't. I mean, unless there's some polar bear population roaming around that I've never heard of in the Midwest, you don't. What do you talk about in Iowa? You would talk about corn, you would talk about flooding, and you would talk about wind energy. How do you talk about polar bears in Texas? I don't. I talk about cotton farming. How do you talk about polar bears out west? You don't. You talk about wildfires. How do you talk about polar bears anywhere where we've experienced massive flooding from Vancouver to Illinois to everywhere in between? You don't. You talk about floods. How do you talk about it in big cities? You don't. You talk about your health. Climate change affects every single one of us in ways that matter here and now. It really isn't just the polar bear on that iceberg. It's actually us, so to speak. If you look very carefully, those are little humans there on that iceberg. We are nearly as vulnerable as the polar bear. And if we don't heed the polar bear's warning, we're next. So that's the problem. But what do we do about it? What do the solutions to this problem look like? We have to talk about that too, because there's no use talking about a problem without talking about the solutions, right? What do big solutions to climate change look like? The big solutions look like this. There's 3 of them. Number 1, stop putting so much carbon into the atmosphere. Number 2, take as much carbon out of the atmosphere as we can. Number 3, build resilience to the impacts that are already here today that we can no longer avoid. The first 2 of these are mitigation, and the second one is adaptation. And as you remember, we have 3 choices. What are our 3 choices? Mitigation, taking carbon out of the atmosphere, stopping putting carbon into the atmosphere. Adaptation, building resilience to the impacts that are already here today. And what's the third choice? Suffering. And the more mitigation we do, the less adaptation is required and the less suffering there will be. So let me give you an image to explain how I think about these things. If you think of the atmosphere as a swimming pool, and the level of water in the atmosphere is the level of carbon dioxide and heat-trapping gases. Now, before the Industrial Revolution, we already had carbon dioxide and heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere. Why? Because they are already there naturally, keeping us at the perfect temperature for life. Without this natural level of CO2 in the pool, so to speak, without this natural blanket around our planet, we'd be a frozen ball of ice. There would be no life on Earth. So we already had just the right amount of water in the pool. But what happened? At the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, we stuck a giant hose in the pool, and we have been turning it up every single year. Except last year, during the COVID pandemic, we turned it down 7%, and then we turned it right back up again. So sometimes people say, well, why isn't the level of water in the pool going down because of COVID? I'm like, we've been turning the hose up every year. We turned it down 7% for 1 year, and then we turned it right back up again. Why would you expect the level of water to go down? How are we going to get that level of water to go down? Number one, we have to turn off the hose, not turn it down, turn it off. Now, obviously, you turn it down gradually, but you can't turn it down 7% and then right back up again the next year. That does nothing. What else do we have to do? We have to make the drain bigger. Our swimming pool has a drain. What is the drain? It's the way that the biosphere and the ocean can take carbon out of the atmosphere. And here's the amazing thing. It turns out that we have too much carbon in the pool, but more carbon in soils, trees, grasslands, ecosystems. It's a good thing. Nature-based solutions that make the drain bigger put carbon where we want it, and they help create healthier ecosystems that filter our air, clean our water, support biodiversity, which is also a crisis right there alongside with climate change. Win-win-win-wins, and they help to take some of the water out of the pool. But there's one more thing we have to do. That water level in the pool is higher than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet. We have to learn how to swim also. And as that quote said, we have 3 choices, but we have to do as many of them as we can. So what do these look like? Let me give you a few examples. What do solutions look like that turn down the hose? Well, they obviously look like clean energy, wind, solar, bioenergy, depending on how you do it. Sometimes bioenergy like ethanol actually produces more greenhouse gases than it saves. And geothermal energy, all kinds of different sources of energy from the tide, from the wind, from the sun. But also there's good old-fashioned efficiency. Did you know that we're so wasteful with our energy that we waste over 60% of the energy we produce? And through efficiency alone, the United States could cut its carbon emissions in half and save money and create jobs and lead to cleaner air because, of course, fossil fuel pollution is a source of huge amounts of air pollution that kills over 10 million people prematurely every year. So there's a lot of win-win-wins to doing this. Oh, and it helps with climate change too. What about taking carbon out of the atmosphere? It's planting trees, but it's doing a lot more than planting trees. It's protecting ecosystems, restoring ecosystems, enriching our soils, filtering our water, planting cover crops that suck carbon out of the atmosphere as they grow and then plowing them back in the ground where they enrich our soils. There's all kinds of amazing nature-based solutions that help us to work with nature rather than against nature. And they produce all kinds of short-term benefits, again, for biodiversity, ecosystems, air, water, food production. Oh, and they help with climate change too. Win-win, win-win, win. Then what about building resilience? Well, there's all kinds of solutions there as well, and I'm just going to give you one example. In many big cities across the United States, and Minneapolis and Chicago are 2 of the worst, lower income neighborhoods were historically redlined. Those were racist practices of mortgage loans and insurance that left those neighborhoods often located in flood zones, covered in concrete, with very little green spaces or trees. As a result, when it rains, those are typically the first neighborhoods to flood. And when a heat wave comes, those neighborhoods in the same city can be 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than a better off neighborhood with more tree cover in the same city. So as climate changes, our heat waves are getting worse. And one of the best ways to protect urban areas from heat waves is to increase our green spaces in our tree canopy. What happens if you green a low-income neighborhood? You can do it by planting trees, putting in grass, putting in parks, even green roofs as well, and that's something the city of Chicago is doing. What happens? Well, all of that vegetation filters our air. And lower income neighborhoods typically have worse air quality, and people are much more likely to have asthma living in those neighborhoods. It also provides flood protection, improves people's health, addresses socioeconomic inequalities. Oh, and they take up carbon too. These are the type of win-win-win solutions that we need. Solutions that give us cleaner air and water, that protect us from storms and floods and wildfire, that might help us grow more crops, provide more affordable energy, reduce inequalities, make our cities safer, and give us a more stable world. But you might say, okay, so where do I come in here? You come in because you are the best person to talk about this. That's right. Scientists like me, we're number 2. You are number 1 to talk about this with people you know. Now, how do we know that's important? Because it turns out we're not doing it. This is a map showing where people think that they're affected personally. Remember, I already showed you this before. But this is not the darkest blue map. The darkest blue map is here. Do you ever talk about it? Most people say no. There's not a single county across the whole Great Lakes Big Ten area where the majority of people say yes. And here's the connection. If you don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would you ever do anything to fix it? So when they asked me to do a TED Talk a couple of years ago, I said, I want to do a TED Talk on how the most important thing you can do about climate change is talk about it. And this is not my TED Talk. So if you want to go watch or read my TED Talk later, this wasn't it. But in my TED Talk, I explain why it's so important to have these conversations. Because conversations are the window to our mind. If we don't talk about it, why would you care? And if you don't care, why would we do anything about it? It turns out that most of us are already worried about climate change. 70% of all people across the country are worried. 86% of young people are worried. But 50% of us feel hopeless and don't know where to start. And only 8% of us are activated. So what's the goal of talking about climate change? It's not to convince the dismissive person who you know, a family member, a neighbor, the one person you know who's always posting on Facebook about how this isn't real. No, the point of our conversations is to talk to all the people who are worried, and again, 86% of young people are worried, and help them understand how we can be activated, what we can do to fix this problem. All too often when we talk about climate change, we're worried, and so we think, I'm just going to show people the scariest facts I can find, and that will get them activated. Well, here's the problem. If we don't know what to do, scary facts don't activate us. They just paralyze us, and this is just the way our brains work. Tali Sherrod is a neuroscientist, and in her book, The Influential Mind, she says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action. That's not what works. So what does work? What works is talking about how climate change affects us here and now in ways that are relevant to our lives today, and that's why you're a better person to talk about it than I am, and what those solutions look like. And when we start to look for solutions, they're all around us. How does this work? Well, climate changes and we get worried, but if we share how it affects us and what positive constructive solutions look like, everything from reducing food waste and eating more plants to getting our university to transition to clean energy, getting our city to have a climate resilience plan, it turns out that people feel empowered and change results. And that's because our brains are wired this way. Our human brain is built to associate forward action with the reward, not avoiding harm. So when we reframe whatever we're talking about to produce hope, not dread, that encourages people to act. As George Marshall, who wrote a great book called Don't Even Think About It, How Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, as he says, the goal of the conversation is not to tell people about climate change. It's to expand the number of people in the conversation until we are all talking about climate change. So here's my challenge to you in conclusion. Have a conversation about climate change. Today, this week, talk about why it matters and what a really cool solution looks like. And if you don't know what those solutions are like, they're all around you. Go to drawdown.org, just Google clean energy or climate solutions, and you'll come up with amazing solutions of what businesses are doing, what young people are doing, what cities are doing, what churches are doing, what Rotary programs are doing. Solutions are all around us. And how do we tip over that first domino in that long chain that leads us to a better future? We tip over the first domino by having that conversation. Thank you.